Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our U.S. Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of Sunday, June 22nd, 2025. Well, unexpected events happen, and sometimes they happen simultaneously. So, unfortunately, our previously scheduled guest, Matthew O'Connor, had a last-minute time conflict, and I only found out about this time conflict 25 minutes prior to the start of the salon. So he will not be able to join us today. We will see about rescheduling him. However, there have been momentous world events transpiring, and I would like to discuss them today. Let's see. Yes. So I would like to discuss the catastrophe of the United States entering the war with Iran. And in order to do this, I prepared some remarks that I would like to read to our audience. They are going to become part of an essay that will be published shortly to express my deepest concern and indeed my outrage at the actions that the U.S. federal government has taken, yesterday in particular. But let us go back a little more than a week. On June 13th, 2025, Israel launched Operation Rising Lion, a so-called preemptive strike against Iran's nuclear facilities, military installations, and high-ranking officials. There are many casualties of this attack, and they include figures like the commander of Iran's Revolutionary Guard, Hossein Salami, and nuclear scientists, Faridun Abbasi and Mohammad Mehdi Tehranchi. This reckless act, justified by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu as a response to a so-called imminent nuclear threat, was catastrophic enough. But on June 21st, 2025, the United States, under President Donald Trump's direction, escalated this crisis into a full-scale war by committing American air and naval forces to strike Iranian targets, including missile sites and command centers. Trump's decision, announced with characteristic bombast and with the rationale that this was the only way to stop Iran's aggression, has drawn the United States into a conflict that risks American lives, assets, and the very survival of human civilization if some of the worst-case scenarios come to pass. As a transhumanist who is committed to reason, individual liberty, and the preservation of human potential, I condemn both Israel's initial strike and Trump's reckless escalation as affronts to the principles of a free, flourishing, and forward-looking society. This war threatens not only regional stability, but the future of humanity itself. President Trump's decision to plunge the United States into a war with Iran is a grave error, driven by a dangerous blend of bravado and short-sighted geopolitical gains. By deploying U.S. forces to conduct airstrikes on Iranian targets, Trump has not only entangled America in a conflict that could have been avoided, but has also exposed American troops, ships, and bases, such as those in the Persian Gulf, to retaliatory attacks. And again, we can hope that those attacks will not happen, but Iran's regime has threatened those attacks. Trump's claim that these strikes will neutralize Iran's threat ignores the reality that military escalation fuels a cycle of retaliation, as evidenced by Iran's vow to target US allies and interests across the Middle East. So this is a potential set of attacks that could have been avoided had the United States chosen a course of de-escalation instead, but that is not what we are getting. Trump's reckless commitment of American resources and personnel serves no rational purpose. It diverts attention away from domestic priorities, including technological innovation and economic prosperity, as well as challenges that we have in this country, lack of housing availability and affordability, the increased rates of homelessness, the increasing rates of crime in this country, inflation, which unfortunately persists. And overcoming these problems, especially through the judicious application of science and technology, is a central approach toward a transhumanist vision of human flourishing. And what are we getting instead? We are getting meaningless death and destruction. And I have condemned Israel's decision to strike initially. I have written when the strike occurred that this was due to Benjamin Netanyahu's desire to prolong his stay in power. Benjamin Netanyahu is known to be a corrupt politician. He has been on trial for corruption in Israel for many years now, and indeed, initial allegations of corruption against him began in the 1990s during his first tenure as prime minister. So, of course, in a country that is at war, people tend to rally around the leader. And the popular opinion tends to be that it is unwise to shift leaders during a time of war or crisis or national emergency. And seasoned politicians like Netanyahu know this very well. Hence, Robert Higgs, a great American scholar, has written a book called Crisis and Leviathan, which documents how the scope and power of centralized governments and the ability of centralized governments to impose restrictions on the people ratchets up during each crisis. And then after the crisis abates, usually a much longer time than was originally expected, the restrictions, limitations, amount of central authority get dialed back a little bit, but not to the level at which they existed before the crisis. So essentially, Netanyahu is playing a game of how long he can stay in power, because he was about to be deposed, essentially a second time, because he already lost his position as prime minister earlier in 2019 because of the corruption scandals surrounding him. And then he got back into office in 2022. So he was about to be deposed again. And then October 7th, 2023 happened. And when those events happened, of course, they were horrific. And there's no excuse, no justification for what Hamas did on October 7th, 2023. This was a group of terrorists and murderers who infiltrated Israel and killed over 1,000 innocent Israelis, most of them civilians, and kidnapped over 200 others who became hostages. And my initial reaction when this happened was, of course, Israel has the right to defend itself against Hamas. And of course, these hostages who are completely innocent need to be freed. And there were various American hostages as well, and hostages from European countries too, hostages from East Asian countries, so not just limited to Israeli Jews, but this was an international crisis. So for a few weeks, it was entirely reasonable for Israel to strike back against Hamas, including the use of military force to try to take out the leadership of Hamas. But what actually happened? Did Israel execute surgical strikes against Hamas's leadership? Initially, that was the hope, but that's not how it turned out. Did Israel attempt missions specifically for the rescue of the hostages or negotiations to rescue the hostages? Yes, negotiations were undertaken. In my view, though, they were undertaken half-heartedly and they were not a priority for the Israeli government. The priority for the Israeli government seems to have been, one, punishment of the people of Gaza, who were, I think, unfairly lumped together with Hamas. Yes, there are some Hamas sympathizers there, but I think the vast majority of the civilian population of any area just wants to lead peaceful lives. And they do not have control over their government. It's a myth that, oh, the people get the government they deserve, and if they don't like their government, they should overthrow it. By what means are ordinary, largely defenseless civilians who do not have any fighting skills, by what means are they supposed to overthrow their governments? So I think the Palestinian people in Gaza were held hostage by Hamas, and their living situation was certainly made worse by the Israeli bombing campaigns. And some hostages have been freed, largely due to the assistance of the United States and European powers in negotiations, because whatever the flaws of American foreign policy, I think US administrations have tended to be more restrained in the Middle East than the Israeli governments, particularly under Netanyahu. So there have been some successes, but tens of hostages at least have lost their lives. Dead hostages continue to be discovered. And there were situations when the Israeli Defense Forces killed hostages who had freed themselves and had tried to escape and denounce themselves to the IDF troops that were in Gaza. So this was a clear situation where the Israeli military had become, let's say, enraged and acting far outside the legitimate scope of proportional retaliation in war. Rather, it had adopted a mentality of shoot first and ask questions later. And we have to ask, the Israeli military is so much more powerful than Hamas, than any terrorist forces that it has been fighting against. The Israeli military has been very successful over time in achieving objectives in Gaza, such as killing all of the senior Hamas leadership. There are essentially no senior Hamas leaders left. All of the people who masterminded the October 7th attacks, all of the people who were involved in them are now dead for all practical purposes. So the ability for these attacks to recur, at least from that source, from Hamas, is close to nil. So why is this campaign continuing? Well, again, Netanyahu is a corrupt politician. He wants to stay in power. Very seldom does a leader of a wartime country get deposed in a time of war. Furthermore, Netanyahu isn't even the worst of the Israeli politicians. He has in his coalition members of his cabinet, including two named Smotrich and Ben Gvir, who are very aggressively expansionistic. And they believe, based on theological reasons, so not rational secular reasons, but theological reasons, that it is the duty of Jews to expel non-Jews from the territory they consider to be Greater Israel. Now, as a party that prizes secular values, of course, the U.S. Transhumanist Party does not accept any religious arguments from any faith, any theology for why people shouldn't be allowed to live where they live. And I stress it's irrelevant whether it's Judaism, Christianity, Islam, whatever the case may be. We do not accept religious justifications for limiting the freedom of individuals to live where they choose. And more moderate Israeli governments have tended to adhere to that. So Israel does have a population of over 1 million Arabs living there, and they tend to be treated better than the Palestinians in Gaza or the West Bank. But that was because there are factions or movements within Israel that do try to essentially act on the basis of more secular values. But those are not the people in power right now. The people in power are from the coalition that Netanyahu has assembled. And that coalition is driven by the interests of these aggressive expansionists like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, because without them, Netanyahu's government will fail. And that's another reason why Netanyahu is not interested in peace. He's not interested in de-escalation, because if he were to acquiesce to a reasonable ceasefire, then, well, coalition partners with government would collapse. So this is why the war in Gaza was dragging on for so long. But of course, that war had met with a great deal of international condemnation. There have been protests throughout the world, and even people who originally supported Israel's right to defend itself recognized over time that this had gone too far, that this war was lasting far too long in terms of what it would actually take for a reasonable proportional retaliation against the aggression of a ragtag terrorist group like Hamas. Israel had already expanded the war into Lebanon to destroy not just the leadership of Hezbollah, and Hezbollah has been fighting on the side of Hamas against Israel, but also cities in Lebanon have been bombed. Many innocent civilians have been killed. So that is already an illegitimate extension of the scope of the war. But I think there came to be a recognition that if the war were limited to Gaza or even to Lebanon, it would still run its course pretty soon, because the patience within Israel for the delays in getting the hostages freed had already been running thin. So Netanyahu needed another way to continue the wartime state of emergency so he could remain in power. And what better way to do it than to invoke the old boogeyman of Iran? Now, keep in mind, Iran has been on the verge of acquiring a nuclear weapon, allegedly, for at least 30 years. And for at least 30 years, politicians, including Netanyahu himself, have invoked rhetoric such as, oh, Iran is just a few weeks away from acquiring nuclear weapons, and we need to strike at Iran now, lest they become a nuclear armed power and then we can't attack them so easily. Well, Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence for the Trump administration, had issued various reports earlier this year, essentially suggesting that the best assessment of US intelligence services is that Iran is actually not close to developing a nuclear weapon. Maybe they're trying. Maybe all of this uranium enrichment, which is ostensibly for civilian purposes, does have an ulterior motive for the Iranian leadership, but they are not succeeding. They are not about to have several nuclear missiles that they could launch at Israel. And the range of those nuclear missiles would not reach Europe, say. It would certainly not reach the United States. So under no circumstances would this be a situation that endangered the US or even the US's NATO allies. So this is not our war. This is Netanyahu's war. It's not even the Israeli people's war, because the Israeli people, in my view, were not imminently threatened until June 13th with Operation Rising Lion, where, of course, Iran's regime retaliated and launched missiles all over Israel. And the Iranian missiles are not as capable of being finely targeted as, say, Israeli missiles or American missiles. So we had a situation where civilians got killed, apartment buildings in Tel Aviv got bombed, a hospital got bombed, a research center got bombed. All of this is very tragic. And I sympathize with the suffering of the Israeli people right now as well, because they were dragged into this unnecessary war that they didn't ask for and they didn't vote for, and they didn't have to lose their lives for. But even worse is Trump's decision to drag the United States into this war. Furthermore, Trump's actions lack the transparency and the evidence required to justify such a drastic step. The administration's assertion that Iran posed an immediate threat to U.S. interests, echoing Israel's vague claims about Iran's nuclear program, rests on unverified intelligence. Indeed, Trump's own director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, as I mentioned, had for months reported that Iran's nuclear program poses no imminent threat. As a rational individualist, I demand that decisions of such magnitude be grounded in objective, publicly accessible facts. Trump's failure to provide this, coupled with his history of prioritizing dubious political optics over reasoned policy, suggests that this escalation is as much about projecting a contrived image of strength as it is about any genuine security concern. This betrayal of reason risks not only American lives, but the stability of the global order, pushing humanity closer to catastrophe. Transhumanism, on the other hand, champions the indefinite extension of human life, the enhancement of cognitive and physical capacities, and a world where reason and innovation triumph over destruction. War, particularly aggressive war, initiated without clear justification, is antithetical to this vision. As I wrote when Israel first initiated its attack on Iran, I do not support Israel's reckless first strike against Iran. Its only real goal is to prolong the war and thus Netanyahu's power. Israel's strike squandered human potential by extinguishing lives that could have contributed to global knowledge. The U.S. entry into this conflict compounds this tragedy, diverting vast resources, financial, technological, and human, from constructive endeavors like medical research or artificial intelligence toward the barbarism of warfare. And we include in this the loss of Iranian scientists like Abbasi and Tehranchi, and now the endangerment of American personnel. All of this represents a setback to the collaborative pursuit of a transhumanist future. Israel's strike was not preemptive, but preventive, aimed at a speculative future threat rather than an imminent attack, as noted by Matthew Iglesias in an article from July 4th, 2004 in The Atlantic called Preemption versus Prevention. This distinction matters. Preemption requires clear evidence of an immediate danger, as was the case, for instance, in the 1967 Six-Day War, when Israel had evidence of various Arab countries imminently being about to attack it. Whereas prevention, or the waging of preventive warfare, rests on conjecture. Israel's claim that Iran was days from assembling multiple nuclear weapons lacks public justification and verification, undermining its legitimacy. This was just Netanyahu's say-so. The U.S. escalation following Israel's lead further erodes the moral foundation of this conflict. The civilian toll in Iran, including casualties in residential areas, violates the principle of ethical individualism, which holds individuals innocent and undeserving of punishment for actions committed by their governments. Again, as I have stated, individuals who lack military training or combat training, who don't organize revolutions in their free time, don't really have good ways to retaliate against genuinely oppressive governments, especially if they don't have democratic means to do so. And certainly in Iran, they do not. And I'm not saying that the Iranian regime is good, or that it treats its people well, or that it shouldn't be overthrown. But if it is overthrown, it should be overthrown by peaceful means. And there have been peaceful means that have overthrown dictatorial regimes before. You don't need to bomb the very people whom you expect to overthrow an oppressive regime. If anything, that further motivates them to rally around the flag, unite against the external aggressors and around that regime. Because for all of the depredations of that regime, it wasn't bombing their homes, it wasn't killing their families, at least not for the majority of them and not imminently. And this has happened before. Every time any country has been invaded by an aggressive military force and significant civilian casualties resulted, the existing government of that country received a huge boost in public support and was less likely to be overthrown as a result. And I emphasize, as an ethical individualist, each life lost, whether it be Iranian, Israeli, or American, diminishes the reservoir of human potential. This is a loss that transhumanism seeks to prevent, and we can't have radical life extension for people who are dead, for people who are killed in war. That's just a basic fact. Practically, this war risks spiraling out of control. Iran's retaliatory strikes that also began on June 13th, 2025, with hundreds of drones and ballistic missiles launched against Israel, may now expand to target US assets. The IDF itself has warned of a prolonged operation, and now this is bolstered by US involvement. All of these factors suggest a deepening quagmire. The disruption of nuclear negotiations, with Iran withdrawing from talks previously scheduled from June 15th, 2025, eliminates a diplomatic path to de-escalation. The economic fallout, spiking oil prices and market instability, threatens global prosperity, further diverting resources from humanity's advancement. The US entry into this war exponentially increases the risk of a broader conflict involving world powers, potentially erupting into a world war with existential consequences for humanity. The existence of nuclear arsenals creates what is a precarious balance during the best of times, one that could be all too easily disrupted by miscommunication, human error, or deliberate aggression. Iran's nuclear program, though damaged, remains a flashpoint. The US strikes may push Iran to accelerate weaponization as a deterrent. Indeed, what just happened should be the strongest case for Iran's leadership to accelerate its pursuit of nuclear weapons or more destructive capabilities, even if their motivations are purely defensive, because the takeaway that they will get from all of this is essentially our defenses weren't strong enough, we weren't fast enough in developing a sufficient deterrent, and look what happened. And of course, the more Iran tries to arm itself, the likelier it is that this would trigger a nuclear response from Israel or its allies. And Israel does have nuclear weapons. This is widely known, even though officially the Israeli government does not acknowledge this. I think we are all wise enough to understand that Israel is a nuclear power, whereas Iran right now is not a nuclear power. So we have a situation of aggression by a nuclear power against a non-nuclear power. What lesson does this teach the Iranian regime about what nuclear powers are able to do that non-nuclear powers are not? The involvement of global powers, China and Russia potentially backing Iran, and NATO aligning itself with the US and Israel, raises the specter of a world war. And that is the most disturbing possibility arising out of this. The Wall Street Journal on June 15th, 2025, noted Russia's condemnation of the Israeli strikes and expression of support for Iran, signaling a dangerous alignment, and certainly that rhetoric from various politically connected commentators in Russia has escalated since the United States entered the war with Iran. And it's important to emphasize, a nuclear exchange, even if limited, would be catastrophic. Millions, possibly billions of lives lost, environmental devastation that cannot be recovered from, that makes climate change from carbon dioxide emissions look like a rounding error. And the derailment of scientific progress would cripple humanity's path to a transhumanist future. American assets in the region, including naval fleets and bases, are now vulnerable to Iran's missile capabilities, risking thousands of lives and billions in resources. The broader escalation could disrupt global trade, energy supplies, and technological development, setting back the conditions, including stability, cooperation, and survival itself, that are necessary for humanity to overcome its biological limits. This war, initiated by Israel and escalated by Trump, is not merely a geopolitical misstep, but a threat to human civilization's survival. As I've stated already, my critique does not negate Israel's or America's right to self-defense. And as I have also stated, I agreed that the original acts of self-defense against Hamas were reasonable. However, the elimination of Hamas's leadership should have led to de-escalation, not expansion into Lebanon or Iran. And Netanyahu's prolongation of conflict, now intensified by Trump's entry into the war, signals a motive of political self-preservation for them. Indeed, we see that Netanyahu and Trump have both been beset by crises. I've mentioned Netanyahu's predicament with his multi-years long trials for corruption. Trump, in the meantime, has been faced with escalating domestic unrest, sparked by his heavy-handed deportations of immigrants, undermining of due process and democratic institutions, and reckless economic mismanagement in the form of an arbitrary and capricious tariff policy. Trump's and Netanyahu's insistence on sustained military operations serves their political interests, not the cause of human progress. The transhumanist vision rejects such short-sighted power plays. Leaders committed to humanity's future would prioritize diplomacy and innovation. The resources expended on hundreds of aircraft, munitions, and American troop deployments could have instead advanced medical research, renewable energy, artificial intelligence, life extension, fields central to transcending current human limitations. Instead, this war risks American lives and global stability, undermining the conditions for progress. We have just found out this morning that the United States used 14 of these bunker buster bombs, which are the weapons with the strongest payload other than nuclear missiles that the US has. 14 bombs to destroy the Fordo nuclear facility. And the Iranian regime states, whether or not this is true, that that facility had been evacuated for months. So the United States just spent many, many billions of dollars destroying this very secure facility that maybe didn't even have the nuclear stockpiles or the research operations going on there that Trump and Netanyahu suspected or wanted to target. But certainly that strike did greatly antagonize the regime of Iran. So what is the alternative to this? The alternative is a return to rational individualism and transhumanist optimism. Diplomacy, though challenging, is the only path to de-escalation. The US must withdraw from offensive operations and push for renewed nuclear negotiations, mediated by neutral parties like Oman. And it's been clear from recent months that Trump is not trustworthy as a party to these negotiations, because at the same time as he was essentially saying how much he would like a nuclear deal with Iran, he was actually well aware of Israel's plans to launch the first strike. And the US assistance to Israel had been planned for several months in advance. There's no way to execute an operation this sophisticated without planning it for several months. So this was coordinated well in advance. All of Trump's talk about giving 2 weeks to make a decision for maybe the Iranian regime to come forward to negotiate, that was a lie. It was a blatant lie. Trump did not even wait 2 weeks. He waited essentially 3 days from making that announcement. So this was all done to deceive both the Iranian regime and the international community as to what the United States government's intentions were, what the United States' role in this conflict was or wasn't. And it seems that truly neutral third parties need to be involved in order to keep these negotiations honest, because I'm afraid to say As an American citizen, I cannot trust my own government in this. Transparency regarding Iran's nuclear program with verifiable safeguards could address security concerns without further bloodshed. So again, could neutral countries come together and formulate some sorts of guarantees, including inspections or some sorts of exchanges, international exchanges of energy that would make sure that any nuclear development from Iran is limited strictly to civilian purposes. I think that remains to be seen, but anything is better than war. The international community must hold both Israel and the US accountable for civilian casualties and must demand adherence to international law. As a transhumanist, I envision a world where nations compete through innovation, not warfare, where the threat of annihilation is replaced by the pursuit of human flourishing. The Israel and US war on Iran, born of reckless aggression, risks a global catastrophe that could extinguish humanity's potential. I call for an immediate cessation of hostilities, a recommitment to dialogue, and a redirection of energies toward a future where life triumphs over death. And make no mistake, this war only leads to death. There are no other outcomes that it could result in. The path away from death, the path to transcendence of our human limitations, lies not in the ruins of Tehran or the loss of American lives, but in the minds and hearts of a civilization that dares to dream beyond war. So thank you very much for listening today, and I am happy to engage with the audience for the rest of our time and consider questions, comments, criticisms. But first, Art Ramon, our Director of Visual Art and current Vice Chairman, is here. So I would invite him to share his thoughts on this conflict.
Yeah, I remember being young and first learning about the politics of the world. And I was kind of a news junkie. So I was a news junkie, learned a lot about politics. But yeah, this has been ongoing my entire life. It's nothing new. It's to me, I have this lens of kind of the world. The people in charge want to follow this biblical narrative, and to me now, I sort of see that as what they refer to as manifestation of reality or creation of reality, because they see that there's this idea that we sort of project our own reality. So they have to sort of, guide events in order to fit a biblical narrative. And I don't believe in the prophecy. I believe in that it's a script. It's a script. The scripture is a script, and they're following that script as well as possible in order to sort of manifest this reality. So that's how I see things happening in the Middle East. But yeah, I mean, the war, that's kind of what the Bible says is going to happen, and yeah, it's following that narrative. I would say that probably it's going to get worse. That's the way I see things happening. At the very end of Revelations, things turn out really great when some Messiah comes down from the sky, and things will be well for a while. But I don't think we're at that point. I think we're at the point where things are going to get really bad. So it's something I sort of expected my entire life, but the timeline, now I'm in my 50s. I remember being in my 20s in the Persian Gulf on board a Navy ship and thinking things would be closer to that time, but it didn't happen. Now I'm in my 50s, hopefully won't get drafted. Hopefully my son won't get drafted to fight some Armageddon out in the Middle East. But yeah, it's that's how I view. That's my worldview of the events out in the Middle East. It's never ending. It's just going to continue until one side completely defeats the other. And like I said, whoever wants to pull the strings to create the events to sort of fit a biblical narrative, They're still in charge doing that. And one of my fears that I don't really read anywhere, but that has sort of developed in my mind is that, a country like Iran, even though they don't have nukes, they could still attack us fairly hard. And there are natural dangers. Here in the U.S., we have the Yellowstone caldera. That can be agitated to set off that volcano. It's a super volcano. That would affect the world globally, though. We have another natural danger, and that's off of the Canary Islands. There's a volcano there, and they call that the Cumbre Vieja. It's an active volcano ridge on the island of La Palma. It wouldn't take much to set that off. Iran has submarines. I'm sure they have submarine drones, and they can do that without nukes. All they have to do is set off that landslide, and that landslide would wipe out the entire east coast of the U.S. And this can be done. And that's been known it's been a known danger for a long time. And if I were Iranian and some military advisor, that would be on my list of possible, retaliatory attacks against the U.S. Entirely non-nuclear and easily done with just the conventional weapons they already have.
Yes. Ramon, it seems like your audio has gotten distorted a bit for whatever reason, and this is very recent. So, but I do get the main point that you've articulated, which is that there are many ways for Iran to attack the United States. And it doesn't have to be through launching a nuclear weapon. Indeed, it's a mistake always to back one's adversary into a corner and leave them no peaceful ways out of a conflict, because especially if the adversary is relatively weaker and less capable, it will tend to resort to asymmetric warfare. And one form of asymmetric warfare is terrorism. So why have, say, Al-Qaeda or ISIS attack the United States in the ways that they have, through causing mass civilian casualties, attacking essentially targets of opportunity? It's because that is all they could do. They stand no chance against the US military. And now that the Iranian regime's military capabilities have been degraded, that its nuclear program has been set back, though maybe not nearly as much as Trump and Netanyahu have announced, they are going to try to find other ways to attack America and Americans. And this is the tragedy of it, with these asymmetrical tactics, which I think are highly reprehensible, by the way. Civilians bear the brunt of the damage. And the Iranian regime may say, well, we have no choice but to do that. I obviously don't agree with it, but I see that as a very real threat. Now, you also mentioned how essentially all throughout your adult life, these conflicts have been raging and there doesn't seem to be an end to them. And I remember I was 14 when the September 11th attacks happened, and I was not quite 16 when the United States invaded Iraq during the Second Persian Gulf War. And at the time, I was still hopeful that the actions taken by the US military in Afghanistan and Iraq would objectively defuse the threat of terrorism. I was hoping that these would be relatively quick operations, and if there were some military occupation, it would be akin to the US military presence in Germany or Japan after World War II, where American troops, after the war had ended, didn't fight. They helped with the civilian administration. They helped with rebuilding the countries. And clearly, after World War II, what the United States did in Germany and Japan succeeded. But this was not the case with Iraq and Afghanistan, certainly. And for much of my adult life, the United States occupied Iraq and Afghanistan. It scaled back its presence in Iraq substantially, but there are still US troops in Iraq. And of course, ISIS emerged as a threat in the early 2010s. So the United States had to go back into Iraq and Syria and intensify its presence there. And in Afghanistan, as soon as the United States withdrew its military, the government there just collapsed and the Taliban came back into power. And it was as if nothing happened other than tremendous loss of life and destruction of infrastructure in the intervening 20 years. But it seems other than that, the US military intervention had no positive effect there. And the American people, I think, by and large, recognized this. There was a huge shift within the Republican Party itself regarding whether these foreign entanglements were seen as acceptable. The majority of the Republican base had moved away from being broadly sympathetic to the neoconservative foreign policy of the George W. Bush administration and being more aligned with people like Ron Paul, Rand Paul, Thomas Massie, Justin Amash, who campaigned against further US military entanglements. And even Trump himself figured out that this was now a popular position. Of course, Trump, I don't think, is personally committed to that position. I think he is more of a militaristic president. He likes to carry a big stick and shake it around. He may say he wants a deal, but behind the scenes, he may just want to bully people. Still, Trump campaigned on the promise of getting the United States out of existing wars, including proxy wars. One could say the US is involved in a proxy war in Ukraine by supplying weapons and training and assistance in terms of strategy to the Ukrainian government of Zelensky. But Trump hasn't even been able to succeed at that. And Trump definitely campaigned on not starting any new wars. So what has happened with that promise? We are now only 5 months into the Trump administration, and we don't see that happening. We see the opposite. So it seems that Trump wasn't really serious about this. He was just using it to score political points for his campaign. And I feel genuinely sorry for the people who believed him, who shifted to voting Republican just because they didn't like the foreign policy of the Biden administration. And certainly I had many issues with the foreign policy of the Biden administration, but they got themselves a worse foreign policy because Biden, for all of his problems, was restrained to a certain extent. He did not want any situations to escalate to a conflict among great powers. He was actually a restraining influence on Zelensky and the Ukrainian intelligence and what they wanted to do. He set conditions and he set red lines, or his advisors did at the very least, though he was personally involved in the decision making. This was one area that he actually tried to stay personally involved in. So again, no great words of praise for Biden on his foreign policy, but Biden had the experience of the Cold War. I think in the course of his tenure as a politician, he had an understanding of how devastating a nuclear conflict would be. And that entire generation of politicians essentially lived through that and had that understanding. And now the current crop of decision makers in America and in Israel are hawks because they fail to realize what could go wrong and how their visions of a quick victorious war could end up in quagmire and tragedy. So now let's go to some audience comments here because I think there are many good ones. Elaine Walker writes, "No war." And of course, I agree. As I've said, this is not my war. This shouldn't be any of our war if we are civilians in the United States. We had no decision-making authority over this. We didn't vote for the war. We didn't vote for representatives who voted for the war. According to the US Constitution, Congress is the entity that needs to declare war. So the executive, the president, cannot take unilateral action to bring the United States into war. And even with undeclared wars in the past, say the authorization of military force after September 11th, which then led to the occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq, there was a vote of Congress to enable this. Now there's not even that pretense. So I do not consider this to be a legitimate war or a constitutional war. Mana Makani writes, the USA attacked my country. He also writes, I'm so angry because of this war. And Mana is in Tehran right now. So that's very regrettable. And I would say I am sorry to all of the civilians right now in Iran who are having to flee Tehran, who are having their residences bombed, who are having their lives disrupted, because again, innocent, peaceful Iranians do not deserve this. I'm not going to say anything about the military leadership or the Ayatollahs. I don't particularly like any of them. But the peaceful people of Iran have been under the thumb of this regime too. And being bombed out of their homes isn't going to help them overcome the injustices that they experienced before. Mike Lazine writes, well, I saw this coming with Iran. Trump is so predictable with certain things, with causing trouble in the Middle East. And he also writes, Bibi, Benjamin Netanyahu, is predictable as well. He is like the Israeli MAGA, so make Israel great again, MIGA. Well, I agree. It seems that Netanyahu has the same opportunistic playbook that Trump does, in the sense that Trump keeps jumping from one crisis to another. Trump actually enjoys there being a certain degree of crises, as long as the next crisis can cover up the previous one. And the reason why Trump has been so difficult to foil and defeat is that he doesn't just have one thing that's egregiously wrong with what he's doing. He has many things. And new things keep coming up. So when Trump's critics, Trump's opponents are focused on this incident or this corruption charge or that trial or that conviction, in 2 weeks it'll become old news. And the public is going to focus on something else. And as long as Trump can come out seeming like a strong, decisive leader in the face of the next crisis, which he is inevitably going to bungle, then he survives in power. So it's hopping from one crisis to the next. And both Trump and Netanyahu are fairly advanced in age. Trump is approaching 80. He just turned 79. Netanyahu is in his mid-70s. So I think they expect to do this until they die. That's my hypothesis. At least they expect to keep jumping from one crisis to another so that the people forget the next crisis. Now, with Trump, we have a constitution that limits the term of office to 8 years for a president. And I don't think he's going to be able to pull off a perpetual presidency. But he may install a successor, J.D. Vance or Donald Trump Jr., who will give him immunity and pardon him preemptively for everything. And then he can go play golf or have his talk shows and talk about how he made America great again. Netanyahu, however, can stay in power indefinitely. Keep in mind, he was first prime minister in the 1990s, and there were gaps, of course. There were others who served in that position, but nothing limits the term of an Israeli prime minister in office. Essentially, as long as he can hold his governing coalition together, he is in office. And that is what he intends to do, because again, his fate will not be good if he leaves office, because all of these corruption trials will come back to haunt him. And now he has the apparatus of the Israeli state to protect him. He has a lot of resources to fight back against these allegations. And again, nobody is going to remove a wartime leader while he is perceived to be winning. Now, Luis Arroyo writes, Israel is a threat to itself at this point. I agree. Now, again, I am sympathetic to the country of Israel. I am sympathetic to the people of Israel. I am the furthest thing from an anti-Semite. By the way, both Jews and Arabs are Semitic peoples. So I could say I am pro-Semitic in that I wish the best for Jewish people in Israel, for Arabs in Israel, for Arabs outside of Israel. And I want peace. I want prosperity. I want technological growth. I want economic interactions. I want cultural interactions among these people. Whether they're religious or secular, it doesn't matter to me. They're human beings. They deserve to live good lives. So I think Israel is a good country, by and large. It is a country that has been at the forefront of technological innovation. It is a country that has been very hard won from the elements, in the sense that much of Israel originally, much of Palestine, was a desert, and yet it was turned into a thriving first world with an asterisk country. The asterisk is it's not really a first world country if it keeps getting involved in these destructive wars and the people live under the threat of bombing raids and terrorism. This is not a high quality standard of living. But if they didn't have that, they would be a bona fide first world country. And I want that future for Israel. But in order for them to reach that future, they have to stop disproportionately responding to aggression, and they have to stop initiating aggression. And I know there are large segments of the Israeli population who agree with me, who have protested against Netanyahu, who have expressed outrage at how the Israeli government has handled this hostage crisis. And they were really slow playing the hostage crisis. Netanyahu was in no hurry to get the majority of the hostages freed. It was the US government, especially under Biden, a little bit under Trump, that was pressuring Netanyahu to keep agreeing to deals to release some of the hostages. But why have all of these hostages not been released? Why have many of them now been in captivity for a year and a half? And keep in mind, the longer they stay in captivity, the greater the likelihood is that they will die. So Netanyahu's regime has made a very cynical, calculated decision to let some of these hostages die. And that's a reality that Israelis and the Jewish community throughout the world have to face. The Netanyahu regime is cynically so interested in its own power that it is willing to essentially intentionally throw away the lives of these completely innocent people in Hamas captivity. Now, Mike Lazine wonders, who are the good guys through today? Xiaomi Redmi writes, there are no good guys. Well, I have a view on this. In my view, the good guys are the ordinary peaceful civilians of all countries who just want to lead their lives. And the bad guys are the politicians, the terrorists, obviously, and the people in senior leadership, both military and civilian, who want these hostilities to keep going. That includes some people in the military-industrial complex in the United States and in Israel who benefit from the prolongation of these conflicts because they get more contracts. They get more requests to build advanced weapons. So 14 of these bunker buster bombs were used to destroy the Fordo facility in Iran. That's most of the US stockpile of these bombs. What do you think will happen now? Of course, multiple large military contractors are going to be engaged to replace that stockpile, maybe build more destructive, more modern bombs of this sort, especially if Trump gets away with his rhetoric of portraying this as a success or a tremendous success, as Trump would put it. So yes, the military-industrial complex does benefit from at least the occasional US involvement in wars, though the characterization of the forever wars has been more accurate in recent times. Xiaomi Redmi 13 also points out these are two supremacist religions fighting, with a top layer of having the same cult running at the top. So I do wonder, Ali Khamenei, the Ayatollah of Iran, is a hardline fundamentalist cleric. And as I've pointed out, much of the course of the government of Israel is determined by essentially very hardline fundamentalist Jews like Smotrich and Ben Gvir. So are they that different from one another? Again, from the standpoint of whether they're making their decisions based on reason or based on religious dogma. And Xiaomi Redmi 13 also makes a good point that we need to stop being nationalists. Well, he says it's all international banking. Yes, banking can connect people. Trade can connect people. Cultural exchange can connect people. I think there are good parts about national identity in terms of peculiarities of art, music, food, architecture, history. People of different national backgrounds may have different heroes, role models, authors that they look up to. And I do think all of that should be preserved. But it should be preserved as part of a global cosmopolitan culture. And I'm not saying it should be a monoculture where there's just a Walmart and a McDonald's everywhere and all of the buildings are in this bland international style of architecture. I think there should be a hyper-pluralistic culture where people from all over the world are able to have awareness of and the ability to enjoy and interact with the products of a variety of cultures, peoples, whether there's a national basis or not. It could just be a movement. It could be a movement that transcends borders, perhaps from a cultural or intellectual epoch, like, say, the Baroque period of music. That wasn't a period that only existed in one particular country, though there could have been flavors like, say, Italian Baroque, German Baroque, French Baroque, with some unique nuances. But still, all of that is good. The bad type of nationalism is the hostile or exclusivist nationalism, the nationalism that says, we are the superior nation and everybody else is worse than us. Everybody else is lesser. Everybody else needs to be subjugated to our interests or our destiny, so to speak. And of course, I don't have to convince many people in the West of the perils of that kind of nationalism, even though it seems to be resurgent, given that memories of World War II and the horrors that a certain flavor of nationalism brought about during World War II are fading, since that generation is unfortunately dying off. And again, that's an argument for transhumanism, for radical life extension, for making people live longer so as to preserve that memory of history and their unique views and experiences. But we definitely need to get away from national identity as being the primary identifier of individuals. I am a rational individualist. I believe we are all individuals first. And we as individuals have the ability to pick and choose what we want in our lives. So if we see some aspects of a national culture that we weren't born into, we should be able to adopt them as our own. Indeed, that's the premise of America, at least as originally framed, because really everybody in the United States is descended from immigrants or is an immigrant at some point in time. Even the Native Americans or Amerindians, they came over from Asia over the land bridge that previously linked Alaska to Siberia. So everybody in America, to some extent, chooses to be part of the United States and chooses to adopt aspects of American culture. And we can choose to adopt different ones depending on our preferences and our values. So that's a kind of inclusive view of what a country should be about. Now, do I want all countries to be dissolved in a singular world government? Probably not at this stage, at least not as geopolitical relations are currently constituted, because there would be a lot of arguments about distribution of resources and who should get what and who should vote in what elections, etc. I would prefer a more flexible system of largely free mobility, so people could live where they choose as long as they're peaceful. Trade and diplomacy being the primary methods of engagement rather than war, and certainly for there to be openness to cultural exchange rather than demonizing people from other countries. Luis Arroyo writes, Raytheon et al. And other military contractors have profits after this rising to the top. Yes, that will be one consequence of this. I wouldn't be surprised if Raytheon gets a lot of contracts, if Lockheed Martin gets a lot of contracts, if any manufacturer of missiles, armaments, etc., will get contracts, if only to replenish what was expended, because Israel's Iron Dome has expended a lot of munitions to strike down the Iranian missiles and drones, and more will surely be coming. And now that there's a war, there will be very plausible and compelling arguments that these stockpiles need to be replenished, that wartime production needs to be ramped up. What else are they going to do? And that's the unfortunate reality of war. Once a war starts, you can't just wish your way out of it. Sometimes there need to be certain preconditions for peace, and the other side needs to be willing to negotiate as well. Who knows how long it will take until the Iranian side is willing to negotiate after this. And of course, I hope it will be sooner rather than later. Josh Universe writes, any situation where innocent people are dying is an unfortunate one. I agree. This is why I am opposed to war, and I'm particularly opposed to wars that our government initiates, because they are entirely avoidable. If there were, say, a Pearl Harbor type of situation where the Japanese Empire clearly attacked the United States, then I would say, okay, it's unavoidable, it's regrettable, but the United States to some extent had its hand forced when it entered World War II. But that's not the case here. Trump could have easily abstained from participating in this war against Iran. Mana Makani writes, I'm so angry because of this war, as am I. I did not want the government of my country to be involved at all. Josh Universe asks, do I think Russia will get involved? This is, I would say, the biggest question right now. Will Russia get involved, and to what extent? So as we know, Iran is an ally of the government of Putin. Iran has supplied Russia with military drones and other equipment. So it has been integral to Russia's combat capabilities in Ukraine. Now that the Iranian regime is crippled militarily, and it is, there will be less of a drone supply, or maybe none at all. And there are some hawks in the West who say that's a good thing, that one of Putin's supply lines has been cut in a big way, and Putin will not have as many resources to attack Ukraine anymore, or to press his advantage in Ukraine. That may well be. The question is, how is that going to affect Putin's mindset and thinking? And I would say these immediate strikes probably will not draw Russia into the war right away, though we can see expressions of outrage. Both Russia and China have condemned the attacks as war crimes, acts of aggression. That rhetoric, to some extent, is to be expected. Now, I agree these are acts of aggression. To the extent that civilians are killed, I think those are war crimes. I'm not going to say it's a war crime to destroy a military facility, so I wouldn't go that far. But it's clear Russia and the Chinese regime of Xi Jinping are both upset. So what will be the consequence of that upsetness? Well, again, Putin is in no desire to escalate the conflict beyond Ukraine. That is my reading of his situation. He miscalculated terribly when he chose to invade Ukraine. He thought it would be a cakewalk, it would be over in 3 days, and the Ukrainian military would capitulate to him. He would occupy Kiev. He did not have enough troops when he invaded. It would have been folly to think that one could take Ukraine, a country of 40 million people, with 190,000 troops initially. So Putin learned a harsh lesson. It turned out that Russia's military capabilities are nowhere near as strong as were initially thought, though they have been replenished over time with ramp-ups in military production as well as the use of old Soviet equipment. So Putin has held his own in a war of attrition in Ukraine, which has been very unfortunate. It has been going on now for 3.25 years. And this is where I agree with Trump's rhetoric that it should stop, because over 1 million people have died, and most of the people who have died are, again, completely innocent, undeserving of losing their lives, whether they're Russians or Ukrainians or anybody else. So Putin is spread thin. He is already way overburdened in Ukraine. He's not going to launch another war. The only thing we have to fear is any sort of nuclear escalation from Russia or a nuclear threat, because Russia does not have the conventional capabilities now to do anything beyond Ukraine. When would a nuclear threat happen? I would say the only way for Putin to seriously launch a nuclear weapon is if he fears personally losing power. Why is this important? Because we have seen Putin's rhetoric and where he was most concerned when other geopolitical events have happened. When Saddam Hussein was tried and executed in Iraq, when Muammar Gaddafi was overthrown in Libya in 2011 and brutally murdered. Both Saddam and Gaddafi were dictators, and Putin has a lot of the characteristics of a dictator. He worries about meeting a violent end. That is his number one concern, and he will do anything to avoid that. He will also help fellow dictators and save them from meeting a violent end, like he saved Yanukovych in Ukraine. Yanukovych was, I'd say, a quasi-dictator, corrupt, quasi-autocrat, wannabe dictator. He saved Bashar al-Assad in Syria last year when Assad's regime was overthrown. So Putin clearly wants to prevent dictators from meeting violent ends. There have been suggestions, including by Israel's foreign minister, Israel Katz, who said, well, Ali Khamenei should be assassinated. Ali Khamenei is an 86-year-old hardline Iranian cleric. He is essentially an old man who is set in his ways, who is very dogmatic, but not inherently a violent person. And Putin may well try to rescue Khamenei as an individual and say, okay, come to Moscow, come to Russia. We will set you up in a nice house near where all the other dictators live. And actually, if Putin gets to do that, he will be less likely to respond with a nuclear strike in reaction to the war with Iran. And I am just being purely pragmatic here. I don't like Khamenei. I don't like his theocracy. I think he should be allowed to live, and I think Putin should be allowed to rescue him. And I also think Putin should be allowed to live, because that is the surest guarantee that Putin will not use a nuclear weapon. Putin wants to stay in power until he dies. Similar to Netanyahu, and similar to a certain extent to Trump. And they will each try to stay in power in their own respective ways. I want freedom for human beings, technological progress, life extension, universal abundance. I don't want anybody to die. I am not bloodthirsty. I'm not out for revenge for the injustices that any of these people have committed. I am for a pragmatic solution to an escalating crisis that will leave as many people alive as possible. So my answer in terms of how do we get Russia to not get involved militarily in this conflict is let Putin rescue Khamenei as an individual. And Josh also writes so many moving parts to this. Yes, I think our discussion thus far has illustrated that. Xiaomi Redmi 13 has also written Russia and Iran have been involved with one another since the 1950s. What's interesting is the prior regime in Iran of the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was friendly both to the United States and to the Soviet Union. He tried to deal with both of them. And again, he had some authoritarian elements, but by and large, he was a pro-Western modernizer who wanted to build up the infrastructure of his country. Definitely better than the theocrats who run the Iranian regime right now. But of course, the regimes of the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Soviet Union were very different. The Soviet Union, for all of its flaws, was a secular regime, very focused on science and technology to the extent that its resources allowed. Unfortunately, its economic failings and political repressions limited its abilities to advance in that respect. But it was already a greatly liberalized regime by 1979, by the time of the Islamic Revolution in Iran. So there were tensions between the Soviet Union and the Islamic Republic of Iran to a greater extent than existed with the Shah of Iran. Putin has, I think, been able to reach better relations with the Islamic Republic of Iran simply because Putin doesn't care about ideology. He cares about power. So he's thinking, who are his allies who could help him? And whether that's Kim Jong-un in North Korea or Khamenei in Iran, he doesn't care. He just wants support, allies, people who will sell him drones, people who will even send troops like the North Korean regime did into the Kursk area. Why are North Korean troops in Kursk? It makes no sense whatsoever unless it's just a purely pragmatic type of alliance. Trump is trading some favor with Kim Jong-un for another favor. So definitely there is a history there. And Mike writes in response to my earlier comments, Gennady is on fire right now, thank you. He has read that Iran has moved their nuclear arsenals to a safe location despite what Trump has said. Well, yes, the Iranian military tweeted essentially saying in response to the attack on the Fordo facility, well, Fordo has been evacuated for months, so there's nothing there to really destroy of any substance. And again, I'll take what the Iranian regime says with a grain of salt. I don't necessarily trust them or believe them either. They have their own propaganda and they're desperate to stay in power and project an image of strength. But there could be some truth to this, that maybe their actual nuclear weapons research, to the extent that they have it, is somewhere else, a less conspicuous target than this big mountain with an ultra-secure facility that everybody knows about. And could the mountain have been a diversion for the US to use 14 of its bunker buster weapons? Maybe. But that's all just speculation. The concept of the fog of war is very real. And we civilians don't really know what's happening on the ground, really until the conflict is over. Mike Lazine writes, Netanyahu needs to be subjected to the world courts and be thrown in prison. He wonders, is Interpol a part of this? Well, here's the sad but realistic truth. Nobody who is an ally of the United States is going to be subject to international courts. Even if the US doesn't participate in the International Criminal Court, even if the International Criminal Court issues an indictment, the fact is the US is the leading global power right now. And for all of the pretense about international law, the true international law is might makes right. So there have been calls, for instance, for George W. Bush or Dick Cheney to be dragged into the International Criminal Court because of the tremendous loss of life in Iraq stemming from the Iraq War, including the targeting of civilians by U.S. troops. Now, I don't take a position as to whether those two should be tried in the International Criminal Court. I think in practice, any time window for that has come and gone already. But was that ever a realistic probability? Was there ever even a 0.01% probability of that happening? No, because the United States is the global hegemon, and you don't put leaders of a global hegemon on trial for an international court. That is not the real international law. The real international law is the law of power. Now, we transhumanists want there to be a different approach to international relations, one based on morality and reason and individual rights and technological progress and what is best for humanity as a whole. That's not how decisions are being made today. So what I ask and what I would challenge people to think about is, how can we move from the current international law, which is might makes right, to a different paradigm? But let us not deceive ourselves in thinking that the current institutions will have any sort of proportionality or any sort of consistent standards. Like when Putin attacked Ukraine, I think that was an act of aggression. I think he shouldn't have done it. And I think a lot of people in the Western world especially recognize this is an act of aggression, an unnecessary war that should not have happened. Well, when Israel attacked Iran, also making a first strike, but saying, oh, we were provoked, etc., was that not the same act of aggression? Was that not the exact same situation from a moral standpoint? But Israel is an ally of the United States, and the United States joined in the war. And there's no consideration of what is aggression or what is not aggression if you are not the global hegemon. So the current world order is might makes right. And if you're not the global hegemon and you attack a country, that's aggression. If you are aligned with the global hegemon and you attack a country, the other country is committing aggression against you. That is the reality. How can we have a different reality? So I'll pause for a moment and let Art Ramon offer any further feedback, and then we'll continue engaging with the audience comments.
My last statement, where did it get cut off?
Yeah, I think you still have the audio issue, so see what you can do to fix that, because I would like to hear you more clearly. We have Mana Makani saying that many of his compatriots have been killed in this war and they were innocent people. Yes. And again, that is a tragedy. That shouldn't have happened. Hopefully Art Ramon will come back soon as well. Now, Josh Universe asks, what happened to the original subject of the salon? Well, our guest notified me at the last moment that he had a time conflict. So that's what happened. We will try to reschedule this as well. So Luis writes that I have to come to terms that it's not just Hamas. A lot of groups are defending themselves against apartheid and now genocide. So obviously apartheid and genocide are bad. We don't condone them. I think there are good and bad ways to defend oneself. So attacking innocent civilians is never a good way. And that is 100% always the case. If your cause is just, you don't need to have innocent victims. And I will say this with regard to all sides of this conflict. I don't approve of Israel bombing entire neighborhoods with the pretext that, oh, some people there might be terrorists or the militants might be there. The militants might have commandeered this hospital and made it a command center underground. And in half of those instances, nothing is discovered once the hospital is turned to rubble. So I don't condone that. But I don't condone the actions of a group coming in, killing innocent civilians at a music festival just because they want to send a message to a government that either has been perceived to be oppressing them or has been actually oppressing them. It doesn't matter. Those innocent civilians are not a party to that oppression. I've always been of the view that in these kinds of situations, the decision makers, the leaders, should sort it out amongst themselves. And maybe there could even be some sort of stylized fight, gladiatorial combat, set Netanyahu against Yahya Sinwar, though Sinwar is dead now, but against whatever leader Netanyahu wants to fight, and have them fight it out. I don't know if it needs to be to the death, or it could be some sort of boxing match or whatever the case is. And maybe if any of them are too old, they could designate champions. Netanyahu designates a champion from Israel. Maybe Khamenei designates a champion from Iran, and they fight it out. And they agree in advance on what the outcomes will be if either side wins. That's a more humane way to do it. So that is, I think, a much better way. Xiaomi Redmi 13 asks, who is civilized, though? I would say the civilized entity is the one that doesn't attack innocent people, that doesn't target innocent people. And there is a difference, I would say, from a moral standpoint between unintentional loss of innocent lives. Like if you thought you were targeting a military compound, but there did end up being civilians there, from something like an intentional targeting of civilians. So Art Ramon is back. Welcome. Let's hear your audio.
Testing.
Yes, we can hear you clearly. Okay, keep going.
Okay, I had to reboot. Where did I leave off last? What is the last thing you heard when I was speaking?
Yeah, so you were talking about essentially ways in which the U.S. could be vulnerable to attacks from Iran.
There's off the Canary Islands, there's the Cumbre Vieja cliff. It's like a potential landslide. So it's an underwater landslide, which is, it's a natural danger. Supposedly it's happened before, but it wouldn't take much for a sub with conventional torpedoes to trigger that landslide, which would create a mega tsunami that wipes out the East Coast. So I'm saying there are these natural dangers that can be triggered. And to me, that would be something that Iran could use to retaliate, because they don't need nukes. They do have a sub-fleet. I'm not sure what sort of underwater drones they have, but that's something that if I were the U.S., I would keep submarines monitoring that area, because it wouldn't take much to trigger that disaster of a mega tsunami hitting the East Coast. So, yeah.
Yes. And I think what will limit Iran from doing that is, in many cases, simply lack of technical know-how. So I think it's important to realize, for all of the efforts Iran has made in its nuclear program, its capabilities are not nearly as advanced as those of the United States or Israel, for that matter. So Israel is a country of less than 10 million people. Iran is a country of 90 million people. Israel attacked a country of more than 9 times its population. Why did the Israeli leadership think it was a reasonable decision, even a conceivable decision, for them to do that? Because they see that they have overwhelming military superiority over Iran. So I would say asymmetric warfare tends to be done very crudely, just like, say, the September 11th attacks were done with very primitive methods. After the September 11th attacks, there was a period of time in the United States where a lot of people, foreign policy scholars, were worried about nuclear terrorism, the so-called dirty bomb scenario. I remember attending a lecture at the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations. This was when I was in high school in 2004, and there was a scholar there by the name of Graham Allison, he still writes to this day, but at that time he was saying, well, the occurrence of a nuclear terrorist attack on US soil is not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, because it's so easy, ostensibly, for a terrorist to detonate a dirty bomb in an American city. And yet this hasn't happened. And I was skeptical at the time when I heard Graham Allison make that statement, because I thought, well, terrorists don't have a lot of resources. They are desperate. And I'm not going to say anything about, let's say, their raw intelligence or what they would be able to accomplish had they, for instance, gotten a Western-style education or anything of that sort. But the fact is, they've intentionally isolated themselves from that. And they're essentially ragtag militants who are making these attacks out of desperation. Do you think they're going to have the sophistication to engineer a nuclear weapon or even acquire one from some state which has suboptimal security? I have my doubts. I think they're going to use more primitive tools, but of course, primitive tools, primitive means can still lead to a lot of loss of life. And what worries me is an escalation of even lone wolf terrorist attacks, mass shootings, for instance, or planting of conventional explosives, airline hijackings, or bombings of embassies, holding diplomats hostage. The Iranian regime still has the capability to strike military bases that the US has in the Middle East. And I happen to think the US has a greatly oversized military presence in the Middle East. A lot of troops should be pulled back from that. But the fact is, the troops that are there now should be protected. And there hasn't seemed to be a plan for doing that effectively. This was an area that the Trump administration just seems to have disregarded. It focused on how to execute the strike against the Iranian nuclear facilities or alleged nuclear facilities, but it hasn't given a lot of thought to the fact that, well, all of these American bases, and they exist in Iraq, in Syria, in the Gulf states, and all throughout the Middle East, they are outside of the defensive systems of the Israeli so-called Iron Dome, which primarily protects Israel, understandably. So how are these troops, how are these assets going to be protected? That is worrisome as well. So I think that is important to consider. Luis Arroyo writes, overthrowing a government via peace is very, very rare. Betting on such is interesting and uncertain. Well, keep in mind, I lived through the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that was a completely peaceful collapse. Such collapses don't happen right away. They tend to happen when a regime atrophies from within. So they don't happen when a dictatorial or authoritarian or totalitarian regime is at its peak and is the most repressive. It happens when the elites actually become a bit softer. And over time, they're less inclined to use repressive measures to cling to power. At the same time, there's a rising middle class, there's more access to information, there's more free thought, and there's more hope for the future. And that's the kind of peaceful evolution that could lead to a formerly authoritarian regime, which is now decaying from within, being toppled. There is a lot of evidence that this has been the trajectory that the Iranian regime was on, that a lot of the people in Iran do not like the rule of the Ayatollahs. They do not like being under the thumb of a military theocracy. And many people in Iran are highly educated, they're intelligent, they have a historical memory, they have memories of the Persian Empire, they have memories of, more approximately, the rule of Shah Muhammad. And again, Shah Muhammad was a pro-Western modernizing ruler. Not a perfect ruler, but I would say for that part of the world, a decent one. So with rising hope and present-day limitations, but with the regime not being as repressive as it used to be, that is fertile soil for a revolution, but an internal revolution and hopefully a peaceful one. I would like to see every authoritarian regime fall along the lines that the Soviet Union fell. So peacefully through mass public actions, but largely also due to the ruling elites deciding, well, we don't want to have this particular flavor of authoritarian regime anymore. We don't want to have a theocracy. We don't want to have any sort of dictatorship. We'll find a different way to remain relevant. So in Russia, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a lot of the oligarchs, the so-called oligarchs, were previous Communist Party functionaries who just decided to appropriate former state-held assets and essentially run them like their own fiefdoms. Sometimes that was not optimal either, and a lot of these enterprises became less productive. There was hyperinflation as well, and the people became upset. Hence, they elected Putin, by the way. But this was a situation where the old elite decided to transition to a new type of elite structure. And for all of the problems of the oligarchs, they allowed freedom of speech. They allowed a much greater pluralism of ideas and values in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So there was more individual freedom in the 1990s than there was in the Soviet era. So could some, let's say, suboptimal but directionally better transformation happen to the Iranian elite, most of whom are not ideological hardliners? Now, Khamenei is. He is a dogmatic theocrat. But I think he can still be given essentially a dignified way out of power because he is not a warmonger. Actually, he has said before that he does not think a nuclear bomb should ever be used. He literally said that several years ago. So he isn't intending to attack Israel or the United States. At least he wasn't. Now he may want to fight for his life. And again, the question in my mind is, how does this get de-escalated? How can we get Khamenei out of power so that he just lives out the rest of his life in peace? And then some change, some peaceful regime change can happen in Iran. And then Xiaomi Redmi 13 writes, if you do it by peace alone, you will usually get a new government with enough of the old rot still sitting. As I've said, yes, that could happen. And he says it's always important what comes after. Yes. But the question is, do we insist on an ideal outcome? Or do we insist on an outcome that's good enough for the broader objectives that we have as a civilization? And I will say this from the standpoint of a transhumanist view. I support maximal geopolitical stability as well as internal social stability for the next several decades in order to allow technological progress to proceed as rapidly as possible. Because technology is by far the most transformational force in terms of actually lifting limitations upon humanity. Now, a lot of people think, okay, it's better to live in a democratic regime than an autocratic regime. But unless we expand maximum lifespans, people in democratic societies are still going to live, if they have good health care, into their 90s. Some lucky ones will live past 100. And some people in authoritarian regimes, if they don't lapse into, let's say, the vices of despair, could live that long as well. So if we really want truly transformational events to happen to open up human potential, we need the technology of life extension. We need the technology of artificial intelligence. We need the technologies of automation, space colonization, vertical farming, desalination, energy generation to advance. How do we do that? We can't do that if there are riots everywhere. We can't do that if countries continue to be in a state of war against one another. We can't do that if huge amounts of resources, trillions of dollars per year in the United States, are expended on the military-industrial complex. The only way we can do that is if there's general peace. And in an environment of general peace, technology proceeds more quickly. Its benefits are spread through trade and cooperation, including nonprofit organizations, charitable institutions. In peaceful times, if you're a supporter of government programs, the government programs to make certain goods available can be more generous as well. There's not as much competition with, let's say, military goals. So to get to a transhumanist future as fast as possible, we need to de-escalate as many conflicts, both foreign and domestic, as possible. Daniel Tweed writes, philosophically speaking, all coercion is a failed state. Yes, I completely agree with you. Super Fin Guy characterizes this as the West versus the East. I think while there are geopolitical blocks forming, and if you consider the identities of the countries in those blocks, there is a kind of West-East split. Russia, Iran, North Korea on the one hand, China perhaps, and then the US, NATO powers, Israel. But where that delineation exists is very much an open question. And whether it has to exist is another open question. Keep in mind, 20 years ago, it was considered inconceivable for the US and China to have a hot war, or even the kind of level of hostilities that exists today. In fact, again, when I was in high school, attended lectures where either a representative of a Chinese embassy or a representative of a nonprofit organization that prioritized US-Chinese relations, I forget which one, talked about essentially the philosophy of the Chinese Communist Party leadership at the time. And their philosophy was make the world so dependent on trade with China that essentially if any country cuts off the leg of China, metaphorically, they'll be cutting off their own arm as well. So the idea was have so much trade, so many infrastructure agreements, deals, etc., that any move against China would cripple the country that undertook that move. So that's not a recipe for geopolitical hostilities. That's a recipe for an interconnected world. I actually support a situation where there are so many interconnections through trade that war becomes impossible. As Frédéric Bastiat, the great 19th century French classical economist, wrote, when goods don't cross borders, armies will. And we're seeing that with increasing isolationism and trade, leading to greater military hostilities. And then Daniel Tweed writes, North versus South is the flashpoint for East versus West. Interesting observation. Again, I am hoping for a more interconnected world where we don't have to deal with these kinds of strict divisions or delineations. We certainly don't want another Cold War, though we do seem to be heading in that direction. And then Jennifer Hughes writes, I don't think anyone is betting on a peaceful overthrow, but the fact is, all times we are trying to change a corrupt government should be done in the most peaceful way possible, and it's very possible. Indeed, the son of the former Shah of Iran, Reza Pahlavi, who lives in the United States, was interviewed recently, and he said, essentially, he would prefer that the United States and Israel hold off on further military strikes and implement a strategic pause, as he described it, to let the Iranian people sort this matter out. I think that too would have been preferable to the actions of the Trump administration, but he was saying essentially, the Iranian regime is weakened now. Let the Iranian people decide what to do with it, hopefully peacefully, hopefully with some transition to a more humane leadership. Again, the concern here is if the United States bombs, especially a lot of civilian areas of Iran, that will antagonize the people and turn them against the United States, against Israel, against the West, and further lead them to rally around the hardliners. Now, Daniel also writes, all this bloodshed is from failing to treat land as a logical commons. Well, I would say peace is consistent with private property in land. I think there should be an idea that land isn't this zero-sum kind of resource where one people or one nation should be ready to engage in hostilities against another people or another nation to claim their land. At the root of a lot of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians in the Middle East is this idea of, well, whose land was it? And the Palestinian narrative is, well, they've lived there under the Ottoman Empire, and then the Jewish settlers came in and took their land and forced them to resettle. And the Israeli narrative is, well, we need our own land, our own Jewish homeland. Otherwise, if we only live in other countries, then there's a risk that we'll get persecuted and the governments will turn against us. And then there's this whole debate about, well, whose land was it originally? And a lot of Israelis will point again to these biblical narratives, their own history, saying, oh, well, Jewish people were there 3,000 years ago, and the Palestinians were newer arrivals, or Arabs were newer arrivals to those parts. And the Palestinians will say, well, but we've lived there for centuries. How is this relevant, etc.? I don't think any of this is relevant. I think we need to focus on where people are living now and not expropriate people, not forcibly remove people from where they're living now. Maybe give them choices. Maybe if somebody wants to acquire their land, they should pay fair market value for it. And again, give them a choice and give them options. But removing people through force from the land where they happen to live now, they as individuals, irrespective of what people they belong to or what the history is, that's a crime. That is transgression against an individual and his or her or their property. So I don't buy these ancestral arguments at all. I think it should all be done based on who lives where now and respecting that. Now, Luis Arroyo is concerned about how the U.S. treats its peacefully protesting citizens, and he thinks conflict can be sparked due to violence from authorities. It's a difficult situation because in the U.S. we see violence on both sides. We see the ICE agents certainly not treating people well, and peaceful protesters have been attacked. On the other hand, we've seen protesters or rioters attacking innocent people as well, burning infrastructure, destroying Waymo vehicles in Los Angeles, attacking storefronts. All of that is illegitimate. All of that is wrong. And any party that engages in attacks against innocent individuals, whether it calls itself a government or whether it's a civilian protest movement, a resistance force, whatever it is, the tactics themselves are wrong. The tactics themselves are always unjustified. And again, as to the question, who are the good guys? The good guys are those who do not do that. That's my answer. And I will support those who do not do that. So I believe in the rights of people to protest peacefully. I believe if a government is oppressive, the people have the right to peacefully overthrow that government. But I don't believe in attacking civilians. I don't believe in looting or breaking things. I don't believe in intentionally causing damage. Now, again, there's a difference between inadvertent collateral damage where you really didn't know that there would be innocent victims, that's still a problem. That's still a crime. So say manslaughter is still a crime, but it's a lesser crime than intentionally inflicting damage. So it's important to make that moral distinction. And unfortunately, I will say moral distinctions are in short supply in times of escalating conflict. And that is what we need to watch out for. As human beings, we need to keep our moral principles first and foremost in our minds and not lapse into, let's say, collectivistic thinking, us versus them, these are the evil people, and anything is justified against them. That's a very dangerous mindset. So we only have a few minutes left in our virtual enlightenment salon today. I hope that those of you who tuned in, despite the unexpected turns of events, and there have been several, still found this to be worthwhile, certainly an important subject to discuss. Art Ramon, I'll let you say a few words before we conclude.
Yeah, I'm expecting things to get worse as far as global politics. But even in war, I mean, not everything is affected. So hopefully there is enough stability for technology to keep moving forward, so that we can realize our transhuman ideas. But the news tends to focus in on the negative. So you think the world's falling apart, but it's really just little geographic areas. During World War II, I mean, the U.S. was entirely untouched except for Hawaii. So I'm hoping that there are enough pockets of stability that we can continue to move forward.
Yes, indeed. Well, we have, I think, a very clear alternative before us. We have, on the one hand, a future of peace and abundance and progress and prosperity that can be realized if people pursue the path of technology, the path of reason and morality. And it is really in sight. We've had amazing progress in automation and artificial intelligence, and biotechnology is ramping up as well. So within our lifetimes, we can have the world that transhumanists hope for. Or we can remain stuck in the old ways of demonization, hostility, zero-sum thinking, and ultimately the infliction of death and destruction. And that is what we should hope to avoid. And this is why, in my view, we cannot tolerate any aggressive wars. And there are many people who will be on our side here, because even a lot of Trump's MAGA base specifically voted for him because they thought he would keep America out of new wars and help focus on domestic issues. And now they've been bitterly disappointed. I hope they channel that disappointment into something constructive. I hope they realize the folly of following a populist, opportunistic leader like Trump, and instead seek to exert more of their own agency. If they want to keep the U.S. out of war, they need to put political pressure on Trump and on the Republican establishment, which is still very much comprised of foreign policy hawks like Lindsey Graham, who really would love to bomb any country that's mentioned to him. So thank you, Art Ramon. Thank you to all of our audience members who joined us today. We've had a robust chat, certainly very interesting, very thoughtful comments. As always, I am grateful for the regular and loyal viewership of our virtual enlightenment salons. We couldn't have this caliber of conversation without the kind of audience that we have. How can we scale this up to the world? Because if the entire world were engaged in discourse at this level, then wars would not be happening. Demonizations of entire peoples would not be happening. We would truly be in a new age of enlightenment, and we would all be able to live long and prosper.